Dear friends and friends, my name is Danie Craven from the Nelson Mandela University. A warm welcome to all of you to the launch of Pitch Battles, Sports, Racism and Resistance, written by Peter Hain and Odendaal. As you engage further, as you will pick up from the discussions today, the book confirms the role of sports in supporting a colonial modern imaginary that fueled an exploitative global and national social order. Yet the field of sports, as a figure of speech, has always been a site of resistance, of contestations, and can never be divorced from politics and society's values, as the authors so powerfully demonstrate. In fact, sports activists have been key in challenging broader social ills, whether within the context of the anti-apartheid movement or against racism, sexism, ableism, and other forms of discrimination in sports. Even as this book is released to mark the 50th anniversary of the protests that stopped apartheid South Africa's cricket tour to Britain in 1970, it weaves a massive chunk of the history of sports activism together, connecting it with the present social challenges we are facing. The Herald and Mandela University, located in a province with a vibrant history of sports and sports activism, are honored to be associated with the launch of this book. And this event reaffirms our productive relationship. A special welcome to Peter, Andre, Mark, Nobu, and Alvin, who will be part of this program. Peter is an honorary professor at Mandela University and has a special connection with our province and our institution. Andre was my history lecturer at UWC during the 1980s, and it's simply just great to reconnect with him from time to time through his work. Mark and Nobu are connected to our social and academic programs at the university in a variety of ways, and Alvin, as sports journalist, represents our key partner, the Herald. Welcome to all of you. For us here in the metro, where the COVID-19 pandemic is taking on a worrying and frightening trend, please be safe and spread the message of social behavior change wherever you are at all times. Again, a warm welcome to all of you and thanks so much for joining us. I am now handing over to Nobobele, who is University Sports South African Netball Secretary, a sports, gender and higher education activist, and a PhD student at Mandela University. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Craven, for that welcome. And I'm hoping everyone is feeling welcome in the space. Again, thank you so much for the kind of engagement that we've already seen on Facebook, on the web pages as well, as we continue with this Herald Nelson Mandela University community dialogue, which is said to be quite an interesting conversation. I'm noting as well how everyone is already sending through their congratulations and also just getting interested and excited for this kind of conversation. And I'm inviting you to send through your comments, your questions onto the chat, whether you're joining us on YouTube, to please make use of the live chat function. If you are on the Zoom page, to also then just make use of that Q&A. And on Facebook as well. Please, please, please join in the conversation. So we're going to have a wonderful discussion about the book, trying to understand and unpack some of the interesting themes that emerge from the book. And Professor Craven has already started us off as well, pointing in the direction of the rich history that the book sets to bring. All right, again, I'm asking that we give feedback in the chat room section, whether you are on YouTube or on Facebook. All right, so I'm going to be in conversation with the authors, Lord Peter Hain and Professor Andre Odendaal. And Lord Peter Hain he spent his childhood in South Africa after his anti-apartheid parents were jailed, banned, and forced into exile in Britain. He led campaigns to stop all white Springbok and other all-white sport tours. Later, he became a Labour MP and cabinet minister, then a member of the House of Lords and author of over 20 books. Professor Andre Odendaal is an honorary professor in the history and heritage studies at the University of the Western Cape. He's a former first-class cricketer who played in SACOS and also the NSC. And he's also an anti-apartheid activist. He's an author and co-author of over a dozen books on the social history of sport and the history of the liberation struggle in South Africa. So welcome to the two authors. And maybe let's start the conversation here. There's a lot of conversation on the Facebook page asking about this space of politics and sport and whether we should start thinking about divorcing it. Professor Andre Keert has already mentioned how we can't create this aura around sport. In the preface of the book, you have this to say around sports and politics. You say that pitched battles rest on little-known contextual details stretching from early colonialism to the coronavirus to explain the deep connections between the 19th century British origins of globalization, racism, and gender discrimination in sport, and contemporary developments, and why sport can never be divorced from politics or society's values. Sportsmen and women who had rarely stood against injustice or inequality have started speaking out. Trusted sports establishments, including the richest sports league in the world, the US National Football League, were compelled to apologize and respond. For generations, sports people had been in denial about the racism ubiquitous in global sport. The mantra to keep politics out of sport is fervently contested in this book. And you've committed to this approach to sport, even in your previous books. But what I find interesting in Pitch Battles is that you debunk the sacred aura of sport, and thereby making a case for the acknowledgement of the entanglement of sport with broader systems of power. And then in chapter 8, and specifically, you point out the emancipatory opportunities of knowing the mechanisms by which sport becomes a resource over which to struggle in South Africa. Can you say more about this approach, Peter and Andre, and your intentions that you want us to, that your intentions that you're bringing in when you're reading sport in this way?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for hosting this to the Herald and to Nelson Mandela University, and to you, Nobubele, for chairing us. I started off as an activist combating the argument that sport and politics shouldn't mix. And my argument always was apartheid infested its sports system uniquely with politics in a way that no other system in the country did. I couldn't, as a schoolboy in Pretoria, play against anybody or with anybody who didn't have a white skin. When the Springboks toured under apartheid, it was not South Africa, it was white South Africa. So they injected politics into sport. But in a broader sense, I don't think sport can be divorced from politics any more than life can be divorced from politics, or sport can be divorced from life. But perhaps Andre could explain the broader historical perspective that we cover.
Thanks very much, Nobubele, Mark, and Andre. Can I also say thanks to Alan Zinn and the team, and Alvin from the Herald for this opportunity. And I also have to say what a pleasure it is to be sharing the launch of our book with Peter. When I was 14 years old, he was the worst guy in the world for my parents and people in Queenstown. And ironic, I never could have thought then that I'd end up 50 years later writing a book with him. And we met in very unusual circumstances. On the first night Peter came back to South Africa, I was asked, when he came back underground or undercover in 1989, Sam Ramsamy phoned me from London and said, would I please meet someone? I was due to go to Johannesburg. He said, you can't. And that person happened to be Peter. Our first night together in Woodstock under the mountain was wonderful. And we've been friends ever since. And with the 50 years coming up from that incredible direct action, new kind of intervention in sport, which turned things upside down, ruptured complacent Victorian attitudes that were still in sport in the 60s. We are friends now writing a book, looking back at that time, but also going back much deeper. And both of us still very interested in the role of sport in society today. And it's particularly challenging question in South Africa, where we're going through this period of dissatisfaction with with what democracy has delivered after 25 or 30 years. So it's really very relevant still, and I appreciate the opportunity. Really, we have to challenge that aura of sport as normal, or the sacred aura that you speak about. The founding myths of sport for 200 years or 150 years have been about games being somehow neutral and above politics. That the British arrived in South Africa and had this maverick kind of character playing cricket in the sun in an innocent way. We tell a different story, that it was that sport arrived here as part of the baggage of invading British military forces, and it accompanied them every step of the way through the subcontinent in a 100-year process of systematic and violent conquest. The inherent violence that underpinned colonialism and cricket's growth in South Africa also shaped its character. The mindsets behind British and settler militarism directly shaped attitudes that became entrenched in sport. So sports culture in our context, and really in the whole world, given the 19th century as a period of globalization through industrial expansion and military conquest, until a size of the world roughly equivalent to the BRICS countries today was controlled by the British Empire. Its culture became infused with notions of racism, narrow masculinity, social Darwinism, and imperial superiority. So to quickly end it, it's time to rupture those complacent notions that until Peter and them ran onto Twickenham and the fields in Britain in '69 were complacently held across sport as the official culture, but it was controlled by a certain power structure originating from this 19th century. And we need to be disrupting the narratives, the comfortable narratives of the past today as well. And hopefully this book contributes to that.
Thank you so much for that commentary. And I suppose that links to a question that is coming from David Thomas, who's asking how you feel about the current politics in South Africa, or I suppose the political interference in sport, which is how he phrased it. But I suppose he's asking then a question around how you make sense of the political consciousness of the day. If we think about the Black Lives Matter, specifically if you think about what Lungi Ngidi was bringing up in cricket and the kind of backlash that he received then from senior or ex-cricketers. So how do you make sense of those politics of the day and connecting them as well to the history that you unpack in this book? Andre?
Yeah, I think Black Lives Matter and the questions in sport today are opening up again the issues of decolonization that were so much part of the struggle. So Peter and the demonstrators who decided, holding a banner, the people quietly watch you and tolerate you, but if you run on the field and you disrupt things and you tie yourself to a goalpost and some of the tricks they got up to, people notice. And it's really throughout the 60s to the 90s, the struggle in South Africa was about that, was about direct action to bring about change. We then got very happy after 1994 with the Rainbow Nation and the fact that freedom had arrived and that South Africa was a democracy. the majority had their national sovereignty restored, and things would be good. As we know, it's turned out to be very difficult and full of contradictions, and currently a very depressing periods in our history with state capture and the kind of levels of corruption and non-delivery in South Africa. So Black Lives Matter started with that 21st century lynching in America, but really we've been feeling it and being prepared for it since 2015 with the Rhodes Must Fall in Cape Town and the politics that has emerged from that of a new generation asking questions. So I think Black Lives Matter is a very important moment. It follows up, for instance, in America with the civil rights movement and Malcolm X and those kind of struggles of the 60s. It's reigniting them, and the same has happened in South Africa. And it's a very necessary debate for us to have. And we tried to end the book with Black Lives Matter. We were very lucky because we were trying to explain how systemic racism developed in sport, and Black Lives Matter broke out as we were writing the concluding pages. And together with the pandemic, that delayed our book by 6 months, but it enabled us to end it in a very, very relevant way, to say this is a time where we must rethink how the world works after COVID-19, and also rethink how sport works and the tremendous shortcomings there have been in the decolonization project, essentially, because we're talking about 500 years of systemic violence, that these ideas of discrimination and exclusion systemically have developed, and in our country, particularly in the last 200 years since sport took on its modern form. So it's a good time in new languages and new contexts with young people asking questions to revisit where we are and what we can learn from these struggles that went before, because we mustn't reinvent the wheel, but learn from the past.
I'd only add briefly to that what struck me about the contemporary debate, especially around cricket, was that attitudes amongst some of the white cricketers hadn't changed. They may have gone along, viewed from outside, as I do. I mean, I visit my homeland, South Africa, more regularly now than I've ever been able to do. I'm so quite closely in touch with things. But it's as if people simply hadn't imbibed the nature of change. But then the other point that I'd want to add is you've never had, since Black Lives Matter, Black sports people in particular, and I'm thinking of Lewis Hamilton, the Formula One world champion, multiple world champion, most successful driver ever, and absolutely a friend of mine, suddenly speaking out and providing leadership in a way that before Black Lives Matter, he didn't feel able to do. And he's self-critical about that, but it has emancipated a whole generation of young sportsmen and women right across the world to start asking critical questions about gender equality, led by Megan Rapinoe, the captain of the American women's football team, and sports stars like black footballers like Raheem Sterling and others that before the current period just didn't feel emancipated. And officials, to see, for example, taking the knee at the start of every Premier League game, I mean, people may think that's a minor gesture. It's an extraordinary change for authority to accept that, and the same on the grid at the start of Formula One matches. I think this has impacted into the sporting establishment, and not just contemporary sports stars, as nothing has before.
And I suppose that links to a question that's coming through from Telford Vince, who's asking you, Peter, whether you're disappointed in the South African men's cricket team's decision not to take a knee in support of social justice, when so many other teams and even the other sporting codes that you've mentioned are doing so. Are you disappointed?
Yes, I am, to be frank, because I would have thought of all countries in the world, given the history of apartheid and the legacy of apartheid that still is with us. I mean, Siya Kolisi only became the Springbok captain because he went to Gray's College in Port Elizabeth. He was plucked out of the township and poverty, where he wasn't even getting a decent meal a day, to become one of the best internationals in the world in any country. So the legacy is still there. And I would have thought that it would have, the one set of sports people in the world who should have been taking the knee was in South Africa, to send a signal to the rest of the world that South Africa had actually understood its apartheid history. And so I was frankly very disappointed by that.
I'm going to call on Mark now to just give some provocations, any thoughts that he's had around the book before we then continue with the Q&A. I'm noting the engagement that's happening on the webpage. I'm noting the engagement that's happening on YouTube and Facebook. And I'm encouraging people to just keep sending through their questions and their comments to filter through into the discussion. I promise we're going to read them. Mark?
Thank you, Nobele. Some of the issues I raised in my piece that I responded have been addressed by both Professor Odendaal and Peter Hain, but I'm going to go ahead in any case. So firstly, I'd like to thank the organizers for this opportunity, because it is an honor and a privilege to be included in the launch of this important book. It is vital to bring the story of the sports struggle to newer audiences, especially our younger audiences who often believe that sport is about waving a flag or wearing a jersey. Pitch Battles reveals that it is about much more than that. Sport is about community, social justice, and social responsibility. Now, I was never an official for SACOS, nor was I an athlete of any merit. I was an ordinary member of a community club in Kimberley, but I fully imbibed the principles of radical non-racialism as taught by not only SACOS, but members of the Teachers League of South Africa, the TLSA, and other affiliated bodies through my social interactions in schooling, education, and through sports. Today, non-racialism is no longer radicalized, but rather it has become liberalized, which is a tragedy. Solidarity with the oppressed has also dissipated. For example, how would the SARU team of the 1980s have reacted to the prospect of hosting the Israeli Sevens rugby team? So for me, the failures of the South African democratic transition has manifested itself, which has manifested itself in virtually every facet of South African society, finds in sport a means to celebrate these failures. This book covers a lot of important historical and social issues, and I have made tons of notes, which will be impossible for me to cover in 5 or 6 minutes. The references to the yawning chasm in English football has extreme parallels in South Africa, such as the sad plight of Universal Rugby Club in Kimberley, with countless similar examples all over South Africa. Professor Odendaal's caution when he was departing from Newlands that sport was more than a commodity should also be seen in the rapidly dimming light of the historical contexts of the deceptive nature of the sports transition. South Africa is all about pageantry. And if you look only within the framework of the spectacle, everything is perfect, everything is pristine. There is hope and there are prospects. But outside the framework of pageantry, the picture is markedly different. There is hopelessness, there is despair, there is misery. The annual media parade that heralds the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence does not fully describe the state of horror that exists in areas where people can be plucked from poverty for a lucrative sporting career. We need to look at how we arrived at this bipolar state of nationhood. And in this sense, sport and the transition to democracy requires special focus. In the book, the authors describe SACOS's absence in African townships as a screaming absence. But I think that this needs to be contextualized because apartheid law prevented free movement amongst designated racial groupings. My very first club rugby trip was with my rugby club, Universal RFC of Kimberley, to the township of Isabeleni in Queenstown. And on the way to Isabeleni, we were prepped by our senior players and managers about behavior and protocols. And not once were any racial terms used. We were simply told that we were going to be accommodated by poor people and that our behavior was to be exemplary. In my documentary, Injury Time, The Rise of the 80-Minute Nation, Mrs. Tokom Mlonyeni of Winter Rose Sports Club in Dansani openly says township people were afraid of being arrested, so you had to be bold to join the non-racial sports body. In this sense, one has to consider that SACA struggled under extreme and repressive conditions in the 19 years between 1973 and 1992, and yet it managed to deliver far more mass-based sport than the NSC has managed to do under the guise of the National Department of Sport in the 27 years between 1992 and 2019. Pitch Battles is a very valuable book in that it raises many questions. The hasty negotiations that culminated in the stitched together sporting solutions have not brought about equality in mass-based sport. Rather, it has eradicated mass-based sport. The importance of the sporting struggle against apartheid is actually undervalued in the broader liberation discourse. And yet it is sport that is presented as the flagship of social cohesion, rainbowism, and South African success. It is sport that is celebrated as the crown jewels of transformation. And it is sport that drives the masses into orchestrated frenzies of ecstasy. The SACA slogan of no normal sport in an abnormal society is rubbished by the celebration of Siya Kolisi and the triumphant Springbok team in the 2019 Rugby World Cup, because the reference to the impoverished township of Zwide overlooks the crude reality of the captured state, which the Springboks represent in international tournaments. And while much is made of the 2019 Rugby World Cup triumph, we should also note that the last Women's World Cup tournament in Ireland in 2017 did not see South Africa because South Africa didn't send a women's team. So in conclusion, in the South African context, therefore, we have to ask whether the negotiations by the NSC in facilitating the sporting transition created more space for communities to interact around sporting activity or completely eradicated it. Pitch Battles has certainly prickled my senses into re-examining my own questioning of the transition into democracy through the sporting unity processes. And this is what we should all be doing in order to realize a new just world. And in this sense, this is a very important book for scholars and historians. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, for that input. I don't suppose that, Peter, you have any engagement for that. I'd like to pick up on perhaps the input around Siya Kolisi. I think your last concluding chapter on our Siya and how it places Siya Kolisi's captaincy and his World Cup victory on that historical continuum of resistance against racism and colonialism in South African sport. There's no denying the Kolisi effect, which is what Mark is also referring to, and how that really has triggered the importance of signaling then the kind of progress that we need to see in South African sport. But your departing remarks show that you're also not oblivious to the fact that more still needs to be done. Can you say more on that?
Yes, happy to. I mean, I'd start off with Danie Craven, who was the white supremo of apartheid rugby, saying in 1969, when he was fighting against us stopping his Springboks playing at Twickenham and elsewhere in Britain, he said, "Over my dead body will there be a black Springbok." So it is Kolisi's hoisting of the World Cup final trophy last November is a symbol of dramatic change. But at the same time, and Mark is absolutely right, and we're very frank about it in the book, just if you look at all the black Springboks in that team, they all came through the elite schools structure. They were plucked out of poverty, like Sio Kolisi, and got opportunities that none of their schoolmates would have got, simply because of their rugby prowess. So that shows both the progress, the enormous progress that there's been. And when I come back to South Africa, yes, I'm horrified by the corruption and state capture and by the inequality. And that includes in sport, and Mark and Andre and I depict this. But I'm also I think it's important we recognize the massive change that there's been. But, you know, my dad used to say to me when I was a young boy in Pretoria, if change was easy, it would have happened a long time ago. And I think that's quite profound, actually. You know, change, even in a country like Britain, with a well-developed parliamentary system of democracy and you know, centuries of industrialization and one of the wealthiest economies in the world, there's still massive class divisions. There's massive inequality. Change takes a long time. So I think you should be impatient and keep pressing for radical change, including in sport. But I also think there should be a recognition of how difficult change is, and therefore of how far we've come, but how far we still have to go.
I'd like to add there by starting with a thanks to Mark for those words. It means a lot to me, knowing where he comes from and what his views are and his history, to say the complimentary things he has about pitch battles. And I found his statement of his first tour to Queenstown, my hometown, by the way, quite moving, and it captured the essence of those incredible struggles for non-racialism and for dignity in sport. So I enjoyed that input very much. I think there are two ways in which we deal with the actual struggle. Firstly, we want to recognize the tens of thousands of unrecognized sports people and the organizations that represented them to bring about change in South Africa. I've got a note here about the first counter narratives to the hegemonic colonial thing were as far back as the 1890s, when the Griqualand West Colonial Rugby Football Union in Kimberley, where Mark comes from, also did not use the word colored that other people did. And they said in the Xhosa columns of Imvo Zabantsundu that it did not discriminate on the basis of bala, luhlanga, lulwimi, nalunkulo, color, nationality, language, and religion. That was in 1890. From the very beginning, the oppressed and the dispossessed people started constructing an alternative vision of the future. When the South African Coloured Cricket Board was formed in 1903, only that it was older than the Australian Cricket Board, formed in 1905, and it started provincial competitions in the same decade as the county championship became official, the Currie Cup and the Sheffield Shield. In its rules, clause 25, it said, this board does not recognize any distinction amongst the various sporting peoples of South Africa, whether by creed, nationality, or otherwise. Can you imagine the vision that those people had to say that in the 1890s and in 1900, with a century of apartheid and colonial rule still to run its course? And so a very key part of this book is to tell in History 101 about Sandrock, about SACOS, and about the NSC. And I'm glad Mark is saying we must move beyond stereotypes, because all of us who come from that era are still stuck in sellout or this or that. And it's much more sophisticated. These were heroic battles, I would say, and we try to show that and how we say it is that despite ever-present contradictions, they were in their totality efforts with heroic dimensions to them, nourished historically by a deep reservoir of humanity, vision, courage, and self-sacrifice. And they took place in contexts where liberation leaders had to avoid debilitating civil war, economic collapse, and as Marcus said, group areas acts and 300 laws that divided people on the basis of race. So on the one level, let us acknowledge the achievement of all those bodies. On the other, let us investigate the contradictions, because it will help us understand South African sport today. So one of the contradictions was that SACOS was unfortunately, in the end, through no fault of its own, having these soaring goals stuck within the political geography of apartheid. And that is more than you can expect people to have been able to overcome. So that's how we try to deal with one of the contradictions. Then with the NSC, it's exactly the same. The NSC did not just pop up and for its own individual good, people went into unity. It was part of a strategic mass mobilization by the ANC after Kabwe in 1985, where ungovernability and mass struggle must lead to a transition in South Africa, allied with very sophisticated diplomatic ways with the 4 pillars of struggle. And that included using sport and culture as the soft aspects of sport and culture as carrots in this multi-pronged struggle. And that is how the NSC emerged. It wasn't a few opportunists trying to get some glory at the Wanderers or anything like that. So I like the way that Mark is saying, let's rethink these things. At the same time, and you can't say it's the NSC who led to that, at the same time, it was a stitched together unity from the top to go alongside the political struggles that were happening. Both the mass struggle element, as you'll read with the Gatting Tour, the first detailed study, I think, of the Gatting Tour, and also of the unity process, which paralleled the negotiations step by step. And that has turned out, obviously, after the where we are today, in very inadequate change in terms of the vision that existed in 1990. But the context has changed completely. If we look at globalization today, the arrival of professional sport, the only kind of sports celebrity who makes hundreds of millions of rand in English football, but even in South Africa, a lot of money. The process of a broad national social project has been replaced by celebrity, professionalism, money, and the gap that stays big, as Marcus said. So thanks for those comments, Mark, and both to acknowledge the gains in every one of these stages of the struggle for equality in sport and dignity, and also to try and understand the contradictions that stop us from needing to be where we want to be, which is why it's very important today still to look at least, not just at sport at the level of the Springboks winning in Yokohama, but what's going on in townships that are still trapped in the political economy of apartheid. Thank you.
If I may just add a brief bit to that people now take for granted, certainly internationally, that there can be a Siya Kolisi captaining his country's rugby team. And I just wanted to stress that we show in the book, both internally in South Africa, through the struggles of SACOS, SASA, the South African Sports Association, and heroic figures like Dennis Brutus and Christa Berlioz, Sanrock, and John Harris, the only white hung in the struggle, who was chair of Sanrock at one time in the 1960s. This was a hard struggle. It was a hard struggle inside South Africa, particularly, and this is documented for the first time, the number of SACOS and non-racial sports officials who were banned, harassed, sacked from their jobs and so on. But internationally too, you know, I may have led those non-violent direct action invasions of the pitches, but you know, the South African Security Service has sent me a letter bomb of the kind that assassinated anti-apartheid activists right across the world, including Albie Sachs injured and Ruth First murdered in Maputo. So this was a hard battle waged by a very courageous generation of activists in both inside the country and outside. I just wanted to register that.
Thank you for that input then, and thank you again, Mark, for that provocation. There's a couple of comments that are coming through, obviously, given the discussion that we've just had following Mark's provocation. You know, people just agreeing quite a lot with what Mark is saying and agreeing with the stance that the book takes in accordance then to SACOS. There's a question then that's coming in from Ferdosa Munda, and they're saying, and they're asking both Prof. Odendaal and Peter, what do you make then of the transformation targets and the divisive response that we are seeing to the aggressive transformation policy being adopted by Cricket South Africa? So Andre, maybe you could start us off with that answer. What do you make then of the transformation targets and how divisive the response has been?
I was going to let the good Lord go first, but let me try start that. Thanks very much, Firdaus, for the question. I've been involved in Cricket South Africa's transformation projects for a long time. And I think the bottom line is that without targeted plans for change, plans that are systematic to bring about a reordering of the sporting infrastructure and system in South Africa, it won't happen on its own. So I'm in favor of setting goals, and it's more targets than strict quotas. I've always seen it as, if there's the motivation there, the will to get to a goal politically and socially, we can get it taking everyone along with us. And that is the responsibility. In South Africa today, I think something like 84% of young people under 30 are African people. And you cannot have a sports system that does not redress the historic inequalities in a very focused, conscious way and in a radical way, because how can South Africa in 2025 still be showing all the hallmarks of a colonial kind of architecture? So I'm a firm believer in transformation that builds and that brings everyone along together and changes in real terms.
Peter, there's a question that's coming through from Carl Hofmeyer. And I suppose the question is coming on the backdrop of everything that you've agitated for, the kind of change, not only in sport, but in corruption generally in South Africa. And Carl is asking, what emotions do you experience when you watch the Springboks play England or Wales?
Well, I'm always asked, do I support the Springboks or England? And my answer is Wales, because I've lived in Wales for the most of my life for the last 30 years. And I'm speaking to you from South Wales, my former parliamentary constituency. But I'm thrilled when I see the Springboks. When the Wales having been eliminated earlier, I just thought that Rugby World Cup final was so emotional and so thrilling. And, you know, I love seeing South Africa doing well in sport, because I think back to what it was like and how much progress has been made. I mean, it's a point I'm repeating, but how much progress still has to be made. So I was absolutely thrilled, Carl. But I also think that we in the bit in the chapter entitled Our Seer, where we describe all of that, we also describe the realities that he came from, not even being able to get one meal a day, sleeping on the floor of his grandmother's home, and so on. Because there's a tendency internationally to see South Africa in kind of, either it was absolutely miraculous under Mandela, or it's a complete car crash now. And, both the perspectives, in my view, were all too simplistic. Though I am horrified by the extent of the corruption. I mean, the values of the freedom struggle and the way they've been prostituted and betrayed by leaders of the African National Congress. When you think of the sacrifices made by Govan Mbeki and Walter Sisulu and Ahmed Kathrada and Andrew Mangeni and Nelson Mandela himself, and all that generation of activists who had integrity about them. And the lack of integrity is one of the things that I find most appalling about the governance of South Africa, particularly under former President Zuma, but there's still a lot of it.
Thanks for that, Peter. Andre, I'm going to pose this question to you. It's coming from Ahmed Gina. And they're asking, given with all the challenges that we've been through as a country, I suppose, and those challenges, then they still manifest themselves in the current sporting codes that we see. What chance do we have to make sport totally accessible to one and all?
Thanks. It has to be an effort beyond sport itself. Just as society has impacted on the direction of sport from the beginning, so sport can only become broad-based in South Africa with a total societal effort to create dignity in all the living spaces and communities of South Africa. So I think that's a fairly obvious thing, that we need schools and healthy spaces and safe spaces for children, and opportunities to play. And without facilities, without infrastructure, it's going to be very difficult. Although the West Indies is an example of poor countries who did excel, but for me, the challenge is a national one, and it's linked to the marginalization economically that so many South Africans face today, made worse by the pandemic. And that is the challenge for South Africa. And when we manage that challenge in ways that start becoming meaningful and visibly changing, then I think we'll see the same in sport. But as Peter says, it's a continual understanding of the environment, the historical context, and the challenges that one faces, or that the country faces, and then to struggle for those in ways that are effective, which is what his campaign 50 years ago spectacularly did.
I just want to draw your attention to a dialogue that's continuing in the live chat room on the Herald page. I'm still engaging on this idea of a sport in the township versus being removed from the township, going to then the elite schools. And Kisha Tava has this to say. She's saying, I don't understand why talent has to be plucked out of poverty and given opportunities at old established white schools. How many of our children are being denied an opportunity to develop their talent from a young age because they cannot attend an elite school? Saying there has been a tremendous amount of development is untrue, because if there was a tremendous amount of development, talent would be sourced from township and elite schools. And a response then coming in from another viewer who's saying the removal of PE as a standalone subject from the school curriculum is a factor in the demise of school sport. The pursuit of elitism leads to players being plucked out of poverty and no opportunities for participation for those who cannot afford to go to established white schools. And I just want to remind everyone that simply by sharing your views and comments, you stand a chance to then win a copy of the book, courtesy of Jonathan Ball Publishers. So please continue engaging with us. All right. Mark, I'm going to bring you in here. I believe you do have a question that you'd like to pose to Peter and Andre.
Well, I have questions as well as some comments. I do understand, that perhaps playing the blame game is not going to be helpful. But in terms of our sport and the pageantry around sport, we have to look at how sport was used to possibly deflect attention away from what was happening in the political spectrum. I'll give you an example of the '95 World Cup, which is our seminal moment, coming of age moment as a nation. We need to look at that '95 tournament again, and we need to give it careful scrutiny, because that was a tournament that South Africa did not bid for. They were awarded that tournament based on certain criteria, whatever that may be. And in an interview with SA Sports Illustrated in 2012, rugby commentator Hugh Bladen revealed that the money negotiations, the TV deal, was actually being negotiated in 1994 already. But the decision to announce the $550 million deal, which they shared with Australia and New Zealand, was only made a day after South Africa won you beat New Zealand in the final. Now, according to a report by Chris Rea of, I think it's The Guardian in the UK, South Africa got the biggest share of that pie that was supposed to be divided up into three, because according to them, they had development needs in the country. We need to look at that tournament again, because it was that TV deal, that $550 million deal, that took rugby away from the masses. There's no rugby broadcast on the SABC today. 95 was the last tournament that was broadcast on, and I'm talking all rugby. There's no school rugby, there's no Currie Cup rugby, there's nothing broadcast on SABC. They only get a special license to show the Springboks play in the World Cup every 4 years. So, there's a whole lot going on there. This is about selling an image to people. For me, professional sport serves no purpose. It serves no social purpose. The only sport that is valuable is community sport. It's where people meet together on the field and interact with each other. Professional sport can make political statements, but it doesn't really have political value.
I think if I just briefly respond, I take Mark's point entirely, but on the other hand, say the British Premier League, which is the richest soccer league in the world, that has got a mass following. And yet it's only in recent years that for example, women's football, women's soccer in Britain has been on television at all, or that women have started to get properly represented and properly organized. And for example, Manchester United's women's team didn't exist until a few years ago in any real sense, is now competing at the top of the Women's Premier League. So, I mean, these are all, I think it would be a mistake to say that the top level of sport should just be dismissed because it has a massive following. What we have to insist on, and it's an argument live at the moment in British soccer, is that there's some redistribution and greater equality between the top, which represents sort of big capital and globalization and so on a, it's what happened, for example, to my club, Chelsea, when Roman Abramovich bought it and injected over £1 billion sterling into it, transformed it. But, you then look at clubs in the lower leagues in Britain going bankrupt. And as a result of COVID, I mean, it's had a terrible effect. So these inequalities are everywhere and they reflect the economic system. It's not just, I think, a South African problem.
Perhaps some food for thought coming in from Daryl Locke on Facebook. maybe as an indication for your next book, I suppose, please can you entertain his comment? Daryl is asking, so you're saying this about cricket and rugby, where are the whites in South African soccer? Andre, would you like to comment on that, on what Daryl Locke is asking? You're saying so much about cricket and transformation in cricket and rugby. What are you saying about whites in South African soccer?
Peter's the soccer fan. I'm the rugby and cricket fan probably for historical reasons. But clearly, again, is soccer played at these schools that produce the superstars in rugby and cricket? That would be one question. And it is linked to our silos that we've operated in apartheid South Africa. I can't answer it because I don't know enough about soccer. We need to go back to that 1990s as a base to start growing involvement of everyone, when people used to shout fish across every stadium when South Africa played. And of course, he seems to have joined AfriForum now, so that's a backward step for soccer in terms of what people represent, perhaps. But I can't answer his question with any sense of authority, except
I would only observe on top of what Andre said. And look, I don't have the knowledge through living in South Africa or following soccer on a daily basis like I do the Premier League in Britain. But it's been a mystery to me and a source of real pain, actually, that the sport that has the biggest mass following in South Africa, namely soccer, that the national team is relatively so poor, even in African, in the African Cup. South Africa should be top of the tree, and the clubs should be internationally competitive, the Orlando Pirates and the Kaizer Chiefs and so on, and they're not. And I think maybe that has something to do with it, as well as the question of grassroots opportunities. But the lack of grassroots opportunities is true right the way across the world. There are very few Maradonas, and similarly in soccer globally, and the same plucking of young, talented 7-8-year-olds, sometimes even younger, from their schools and into the football academies of the Chelseas and the Manchester Uniteds and the Arsenals and Manchester Cities and so on. It's exactly the same process that is going on. So although Britain is a much richer society without the apartheid legacy, though still a class-ridden one, the same lack of opportunity is true globally in sport. So there's a big argument that I think has been fueled also by Black Lives Matter to go on through sport too, and gender is especially key to that.
Yeah, sorry, Nobe, if I may. I don't think that Daryl is being quite positive in his comment, because is he able to name any of the so-called white professional clubs in South Africa? Does he know any of the so-called white professional players that should be mentioned? I mean, the South African soccer team was captained on a few occasions by, let's use the term, white soccer players, quite a few of them. But where are the professional soccer clubs located in South Africa? And do people go there to access the game? So I'm not quite sure what his point is. Is he trying to infer that that the cricket and rugby is now starting to teach black players the game now, post 94, whereas my club celebrates 135 years next year, and there are many clubs, cricket and rugby, that date back to the 1870s. And Professor Odendaal has written on that, and so has many other academics.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Mark. I think we'll allow Daryl to comment, and we'll read whatever the response is, whether it's coming through from Facebook. And I suppose the last few questions that are coming through now are about the lessons that people can take then from pitch battles and where they can be applied. There's questions that are coming through in terms of what lessons can the book give then to the South African cricket leadership that seems to be hell-bent on making leadership of cricket a white sport club. And David is then also asking the implications of the book and the lessons of the book to perhaps the Department of Sport and Recreation, the Department of Education, and so on. In your view then, Peter and Andre, and Peter, we'll just start with you. What are the lessons from the book and where do you see it then most applied?
Well, first of all, that the sport struggle is not just something recent. It goes back, and Andre has done incredible pioneering historical work on that, back to colonial times, and when Britain was in charge of South Africa. That's one of the lessons. The other lesson, I think, is that change doesn't happen unless you are prepared to take extra parliamentary action. It certainly is what we did when we invaded the pitches and rewrote the script of disrupting the Springboks in 1969-70, and then forced the cancellation of the cricket tour due to be captained by Ali Bakr, which had some of the most talented South African cricketers that they've ever been, by international standards as well, stopped that tour by the threat of direct action, because we would have wrecked it. And the same thing happened in Australia the following year. A rugby team, a Springbok team, was demonstrated against and disrupted, and then the cricket tour was stopped. And then over the years, the similar things happened in New Zealand as well. So there was this international struggle, and it was actually spurred by militant action. It didn't happen by writing letters to the leaders of sport. That got you nowhere. So I think that's another lesson. And then the third lesson I've sort of touched on is that this history of sports apartheid has much wider ramifications globally for all the other issues that are live in sport at the moment. Not just racial inequality, including in Britain, with, for example, many black soccer stars in the Premier League, but very few black coaches and even fewer black officials in British soccer. And those issues of inequality, of not just racial inequality, but also gender inequality, they're all kind of bubbling up in this period, and quietly so. I think another lesson of the book, and I finally say that it underlines that change is very, very hard, and we can kind of, pick it apart and pontificate on it, but in the end, it's activism, and that you keep going and you keep fighting, and you don't achieve it tomorrow or next week or next month or next year even. You've got to keep fighting for it. And we end on that theme to say that the struggle continues.
Thanks. I think for me, it's really to help understand how old cultures and attitudes and structures and privileges and leaderships and assumptions have been inherited from a past that was constructed on the basis of inequality, exclusion, discrimination, what colonialism and apartheid represented, not in a politically correct way, but in a deeply impactful, violent exclusion of people from cradle to grave. So the 20th century, after 1894, when Crom Hendricks was good enough to play for South Africa, said to be the fastest bowler in the world by the English professionals, and Cecil John Rhodes closed the door on him. It took another 100 years before sports unity arrived. And the message in all of that, in sport and in South Africa generally, was the systematic exclusion of people from human development and advancement and opportunity. So it then gets couched in sporting terms in ways that make it seem natural, like the soccer discussion we've had. like the fact that do Africans play cricket? They don't have a cricket tradition or a rugby tradition. That used to be a very common debate. So we have to fight the normalization of old attitudes in new guises. And to do that, it helps to understand the past and how the whole thing happened. And I think the issue of women is very important there, as Peter said. And I think Nobubele, you also mentioned, as the one real sportsperson amongst us here who represented South Africa at netball, how coming into a space as a talented Black woman or young woman disrupted the kind of assumptions of the people running the game. You weren't supposed to be in the attacking side of the team. You needed to be a defender, because as in rugby and as in quarterbacks in America until the 1960s, Black sports people didn't fill those fancy roles. So race has been the big issue of the 20th century, and it remains a massive issue in South Africa, but an exclusion going with that is the issue of how women have been excluded. So that if one goes back to the Victorian times, people like Pierre de Coubertin, who started the Olympics, was totally against women participating, thought they would become sort of frightful stereotypes of what women could become. I mean, I could just read, horse riding was said to lead to unnatural consolidation of the lower part of the body, ensuring a frightful impediment to future functions. Hockey could disable women from breastfeeding. Athletics was said to produce an unnatural race of Amazons, unproductive breeders who would contribute to the deterioration, quote, of the human race. Cycling was an indolent and indecent practice which would even transport girls to prostitution. Sport generally was likely to do irreparable damage to the adolescent girl. Those kind of Victorian stereotypes explain why, you know, the rugby and soccer clubs had long rooms where only men were, where only men are at the finish line in the horse races, and how Black and women bodies are controlled in the sporting environment. And W.G. Grace said that the women who played were neither ladies nor cricketers at that time. And that kind of attitude in sport has persisted deeply until the present. And it's only in recent years that we're seeing, with democracy, in fact, because women's advancement in sport has always gone with political rights, that women are now seriously making inroads. And I think one of the best contributions the struggle can make is to make sure that no discussion about transformation in sport happens without women being part of the discussion, the empowerment of women and the creation of opportunities. And we're seeing such incredible cricket at the last World Cup, and the beauty of a Shibnam Ismail as bowling and fielding from fine leg and so on. It's poetry to watch these good athletes, and football's the same. So I think, to me, that's one of the issues, of attitudes, of women's positions in sport, and then the socio-economic change we talked about. We have to understand how important the context is in the success of sport. And what Mark mentioned and Peter emphasized in a different way, the kind of recent growth of professional sport as part of economic globalization into stratospheric kind of figures. And you know, it represents the 1%ers in society in a massive way, which means that people are becoming more and more separated from that level. And I think in a country like South Africa, we've got to look beyond the trickle-down effect that the wealthy and the famous can give to us at the bottom, and have strategic interventions where social programs are part of all our plans. And that is what has happened. You know, that is what people try to do, but it often gets lost, as you say, when the pageantry and the flags start flying. Thanks, Nobubel.
Thanks so much for that, Andre. I'm just going to check with Peter. Andre, I'm going to take it as those are your closing remarks then for the session. Peter, I just want to check if you have anything to add just in closing for this discussion we've had.
Well, just to thank you very much, and to thank Mark and Alvin and the Herald and Nelson Mandela University. And also, if I may, just to the book is being launched next Tuesday by Jonathan Ball, with a session at 6 o'clock South African time next Tuesday, with Taminder Kao and Ashwin Desai, as well as Andre and I. And the book will be available next week in bookshops, published by Jonathan Ball. So I hope people will have a chance to read it and send us their views, and maybe we can have another debate another time on a different theme. But thank you very much indeed, everybody.
Thanks very much.
All right. So thank you so much to Peter and Andre and Mark as well for this conversation that we've had. I'm just going to bring in then Alvin Reeves, who's the sports editor of the Herald and the Weekend Post, just to do a vote of thanks.
Yeah, good evening all. They've kept me muted in the corner all night and listened intently, and been most enlightening. Particularly enjoyed Mark's comments about community sport and how important that is. I must tell you, Peter, that if I can echo Andre's earlier remarks about his period growing up, and you know, in the 70s and a bit earlier than that, but my period growing up in the 70s, my grandfather was a staunch Duplessis, and he called you everything under the sun but Lord. I must tell you that much. So. But certainly time has moved on, and as was said, I'm Alvin Reeves. I'm the provincial sports editor of the Herald and the Daily Dispatch newspapers in the Eastern Cape. My job is a simple but important one tonight, and that is to most sincerely thank you all for joining us for this, our 5th Herald Community Dialogue for 2020. These webinars have certainly worked well for us, and that's because there's been more engagement from you, the public, and from a few sports journo colleagues that I saw trying to sniff out a scoop there, Fridoz and Telford. Welcome to all the journos that are on here. Good to have you here, and spread the word. If you'd like to catch up with the other 4 dialogues presented by Nelson Mandela University's Canrad and ourselves, please visit the Herald website, Herald Live website, Facebook page, and click on the videos tab, and you'll be able to watch them there. But again, I'd just like to thank the audience, our partners Canrad of Nelson Mandela University, our moderator Nobu, Mark Fredericks and Andre Kurt from earlier, and of course to our co-authors, Andre Odendaal and Peter Hain. Thanks very much for your enlightening engagement, and for continuing to highlight the ills of our sporting past, and also the current challenges we face. And we know that those are many. I certainly look forward to getting myself a copy of the book when it hits the shelves next week, and adding it to my collection, which also includes Prof. Odendaal's Story of an African Game, which I've read from cover to cover and I really enjoyed. So we were certainly honored to be a part of this launch, and all that's left for me is to wish you a good night, and please stay safe, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Alvin. Again, just to reiterate that the book, as Peter has said, is going to be available as of next week, the week of the 7th. But pre-orders are available, so please make sure that you pre-order your copy so that you aren't in this long waiting queue if you do want the book. All right. So again, we're going to be announcing those 5 winners for for the book, which is coming from the registered viewers who were part of the session. So thank you again. And as Alvin said, thank you for watching and keep safe.